Okay. All right, so now we're moving on to specifications, the grading process. I hope that we've handled that adequately so you stay out of trouble there and you get a good, healthy tree that's going to establish in the new landscape properly. After this assignment of grade, which was a prescriptive process, we've got steps and we've got a fairly rigid protocol there. We enter into the realm of specifications. And this is a bit more subjective, but it still must be within and in compliance with state law and the grading process. So specifying is not as structured. It's more subjective, if you will. Specifying involves judgment, and therefore it is subjective, and it can be simple or complex based on the relationship that you have with your providers and your needs. So it's kind of, yeah, specifications are very important, but maybe not so much depending on the circumstances. In the simplest form, you might specify with a known supplier, somebody you can rely on, just, I want a 10-foot clear trunk, whatever. And if you're dealing with an unknown provider, you really need to cover at least a few of the basics. Like you're going to want to talk about some of the form and dimensional characteristics, the trunk treatment. I want a Florida fancy. That would be the assignment of grade, of course. No trunk constriction. You want a straight trunk. You want the tree to be fully hydrated. In some cases, if you're dealing with those that are susceptible to phytoplasm diseases, you're going to want them to be inoculated. So again, when you're dealing with an unknown provider, or if you're providing specifications that are going out for bid, it's really important to get all of the details laid out in your contract, in your specifications. Quantification of what you have in your mind's eye can be very difficult. And this process is facilitated through the proper use of the terms, which we'll get into in the glossary in just a couple of minutes. And key aspects in this process involve the translation of the image in your mind's eye to measurable, hopefully we can quantify, attributes. And this levels the playing field in the bidding process, and it provides airtight, inescapable specifications, your contract. Learn how to do this. It's important that you get this right. You may not face consequences in terms of legal, but if you provide a product, or if a product shows up on your job site that you're not happy with, your customer's not happy with, and you have no recourse because your specs weren't tight, then you can have a problem with the provider. So if you're looking for particularly those specifications that relate to form and dimensions, call on somebody, get some expert input in the matter, and get things like, what is the caliper going to be? What is the trunk treatment going to be like? Get all of your ducks in a row, if you will. The best specifying for unique specimens is going and seeing it and putting a lock tag on it, because that's awfully hard to quantify. And when you get to the point where you've covered all of the critical aspects of specifying, stop. Don't go on and dig a hole for yourself. That you can create problems by doing so. The assignment of a grade does not equal specifications. And we know that specifications are contractual. Outside of the assignment of grade, the assignment of grade is based on standards. Let's use an analogy. I like analogies. I also like similes and metaphors, but we won't need to use one of those. So the analogy I'm going to use here is when you walk in, or if you should happen to walk into your favorite coffee shop, a Starbucks, and you say, in some cases, if you know the person who is going to be handling your order, you say, I want a 12 ounce or I want a 8 ounce or whatever measure you're interested in. And they know automatically all of those other characteristics of that. They know whether or not you want cinnamon. Do you want, I don't know, the cream or half and half or lactose free? All of that stuff kind of falls in place if you're dealing with somebody who knows what you want. If you're not, a higher level of specification has to be used in order to end up with the beverage that you're looking for. So let's treat palm trees with the same measure of concern that we might treat your morning beverage. Introduction, we're talking about a different process, so we've got a different introduction. And again, contracts, the specifications are contractual. They're not provided for in that step-by-step process that we used for establishing a grade. They, of course, cannot conflict with the grading process either, for that matter. Here is the beginning of our glossary. You got to have a glossary. You're going to communicate. You've got to be using these same common concepts. Voltaire, or one of those fellows a long time ago, said, if you wish to communicate with me, define your terms. So here we are in that definition of terms. A boot is the first one that shows up there. I think most of us know what a boot is. That's just simply the remaining portion of the leaf petiole on the trunk of the tree. Booted is those boots remain in place, usually at the top of the stem or the top of the trunk. And we talked about the importance of not damaging the vascular tissue in the tree, and by leaving sables in particular are treated this way. By leaving those boots in place, we don't take a chance of damaging the tree and perhaps introducing Thalidomopsis or some sort of an insect that would cause damage to the tree. And this just averts trunk damage in general in that softer tissue that's a part of the upper part of the trunk. Caliper, and for the definition of caliper, let's look very closely at the part of that definition that's really important. That prepositional phrase that says after prescribed treatment is important, because you're going to have a different caliper on the same tree if you use if it is a clean trunk, or if it's a diamond trunk or diamond cut trunk, or one of the other treatments that might leave a part of that petiole base in place. As we move on, let's see, caliper, canopy spread. Do you want cinnamon in your coffee or not? So what we're talking about here is, and we're going to see some pictures of some trees that show us a great disparity within the same species in canopy spread. And they're both going to be Florida fancies, but they're going to have different impacts in the landscape. Canopy or character palms, diagrams and notes will help, but you might want to ask for pictures. And again, this may be a case where you want to go out and put a lock tag on that tree. Now we get to clean trunk, and I'm going to advance a frame or two here to show you an example of a clean trunk palm. And in that top right frame that is pictured there on the right-hand side with those 6 trunk treatments, look at this area right here, and I think you can probably see where my pointer is going. You're going to see a bit of a protrusion. That's the leaf node right there where that petiole base connects to the stem or the trunk of the tree. It's really important not to damage that, because that's potentially, here's another one right here that you can see. That's a potential point of entry for disease, or if you open that up, maybe a boring insect gets in there and causes, excuse me, damage to the trunk of that tree. And so when your provider, when the grower or the provider is cleaning up that trunk, make sure that they understand the importance of not damaging this part of the palm trunk. That's pretty important stuff there. And same applies there that we were talking about with the booted treatment. You're just trying to ensure that that tree doesn't get damaged in such a way that it causes disease problems later on. Clean trunk, clear trunk. That's clear trunk is something that we argue about in the industry for years. And so without a clear and precise definition, there were as many different people as there were opinions on what clear trunk actually was. So we came up with a fairly, I hope it's fairly airtight description of what clear trunk is, and it can be defined as that point where the leaf petiole diverges from the trunk of the tree. That's the lowest untrimmed leaf. Now, that's going to, in some cases, that may vary based on the grade of the tree. I'm sure you can imagine how if you've got a tree that has more leaves left on it, that point would go up a little higher on the trunk of the tree. So you've got a trade-off there. I've suggested to you that you want a Florida Fancy, and if you're going to get a Florida Fancy, that clear trunk measurement is going to be a little bit lower than it would be for a Florida #1, and most certainly for a Florida #2, because we've reduced that leaf count by roughly 20% each time we drop a grade. That's what it calculates to, somewhere in that neighborhood of 20%. The clear wood or gray wood, same thing. I'll let you read that definition while I have a sip of coffee here. Okay, cropped palms, and clear wood and gray wood's just same thing. So don't worry about that. Those are interchangeable terms. The cropped palms, which have had most all of the leaf removed, the petiole remains, and that's what we used to call hurricane cut, but now we're applying a new concept there, or a new term for the concept, because a hurricane cut was really, well, something that people used to try to do to reduce the sale of trees or palms during weather events, and so they became known as hurricane cuts. Crown shaft, that's that conspicuous neck-like structure. The crown shaft species, typically they're the more cold-sensitive varieties like royal palms or Adenidias, now veitchii, some of the other species that have that green petiole base that it shucks off cleanly when that tree decides that it's a self-pruning tree, and they shouldn't be pulled off. Allow them to kick off, and they'll do that on their own, particularly if you got a tree that's growing quickly and is a healthy tree. It's going to do that in fairly short order as those nutrients move, those mobile nutrients move from that leaf back into the system of the tree. So that's going to take place naturally. Don't try to get ahead of yourself and strip that off the trunk and cause problems by tearing the fibers in the pseudobark. Debooted, that's just the same thing as clean trunk. Clean trunk needs to be done carefully, as we talked about a minute ago. Frond, that's the same thing as a palm leaf. Gray wood, clear wood, same thing. Hurricane cut, another redundancy. So we've tried to make sure that there's no confusion between those terms. Juvenile palm, this is something that we've kind of dealt with over the years in the reforming of the grades and standards. And juvenile palms aren't a part, we don't use those so much in the sale of trees for landscape, so they've been given a little less attention here. We may pick that up later on down the road, but for now, I think if you're talking about trees, there are palms that are going into the landscape. Juvenile palms just are part of the process. Leaf base, that's that basal part, and we're going to see a picture in a minute that depicts that. The leaf base it's where the extension of that is where the petiole attaches to the stem, and that's where the leaf node is. That's that bottom part of the leaf and the petiole. All right, this part of the glossary, leaf-based trimming, that's that host of different ways that they might be, that the petiole bases might be treated for the finished look that would be the cleaning up of that tree for presentation and shipment. A number of different ways can be done. We don't show booted here, but that would also be a form of leaf-based trimming. Just leave the boot on there and trim most of the petiole off. Usually that's done back to the point where the petiole begins to flare close to the base. Leaf length. Leaf length, well, that's fairly explanatory. It's how long the leaf is from the point of divergence on the trunk to the leaf's tip. Main trunk for clustering palms and single trunk palms intentionally grown with more than one trunk. And that is the tallest trunk in the group or the cluster. So it's considered the main trunk. Overall height, that is the measurement that we used to establish what the root ball measurement would be. It also appears here in our glossary for specs. And overall height should in some way be relative to the clear trunk. Your overall height and your clear trunk height should have a relationship. And if your overall height is disproportionately greater than the clear trunk height, you probably got a case of extreme succulence or some sort of genetic variation that's out of the norm for that species. Regenerated palms. Okay. whole new can of worms here. We use it for the sable palms, for the cabbage palms, because they're collected out of the wild, and in doing so, we cut a lot of the roots off, and reducing the root mass by the measure that is typically done there puts that palm under a lot of stress. So the regeneration process has become favored for cabbage palms, but it's also pretty important stuff for difficult species to transplant, like Bismarck. Sometimes when palms are being taken out of really sandy, loose-grained soil, they don't have an intense root system, and so some type of root pruning or root regeneration might be in order to try to get those trees back on their feet again before they're shipped and installed on the new site. So regeneration is a process that we're looking at with the folks over in Fort Lauderdale, and we're doing some studies with the research center over there. That is not just us as our tree farm, but the industry is, to try to figure out, how and when this is necessary. Sometimes it just simply isn't necessary because of the species or the site that the tree is being removed from before shipment, the level of succulents that tree is at when it's harvested will have some impact on whether or not it falters when it goes to the new site. You do remember that we talked about extreme succulents being a part of an eliminating factor. And so that whole notion of how vegetative the palm is has an impact on how it might do in terms of, does it struggle? Is it a compact head or relatively so when it's dug? And does the darn thing fall apart when it shows up on the job? So we're working on the regeneration process. We'll have more on that later on. Stay tuned on the matter, because we're becoming a bit more sophisticated in our understanding of the importance of regeneration and when it needs to be done. If you do order a regenerated palm, unless it's something that's already been on the shelf for a while and is ready to ship, there may be a delay in that time period between your ordering and when that tree and its root system are fully regenerated. So don't be surprised if you order a Bismarck and somebody says, well, they're not fully regenerated. You're going to have to wait a month or 2 months or a couple of weeks at least until that regeneration process is complete. So it takes time. It's kind of like the hardening off process that's done for hardwood trees. Slick trunk, it's just a bad idea. Don't do it. Don't order that. And I'm going to get a little bit maybe out of bounds here, because there are some that don't like sanding, but if sanding might be an alternative to that, if that's not carried to extreme, because that can kind of brush up or clean up the pseudo bark in the trunk of the tree without taking a chance of nicking or taking a chunk out of that trunk that gets in from the pseudo bark into the vascular tissue. That's what we're concerned about with the whole slick trunk thing, is because the way it happens is they're using a shovel and they're scraping off the old petiole bases. It might have been through a fire or who knows what. in the case of the cabbage palms. And that shovel was just stuck in the dirt. And so they pick that shovel up, they shave off that trunk, and immediately you've got the Phalaenopsis fungus that is throughout the Florida soils. And so there's the potential, at least, to introduce that while that tree is being harvested. So it's just a bad idea. We strongly discourage this practice. The last few concepts or terms in the glossary: sloughing, that's just a natural degradation and dropping of leaf bases. Suckers, we talked about suckers before because that's part of the multiple trunk palms. Well, we'll talk about that in a couple of minutes. When you have suckers, you got to decide what you're going to do with them because they can be a distracting part. And when you're dealing with your specs, you're going to have to decide which way to go. Terminus height, that's particularly useful for trees like cabbage palms because you don't, excuse me, it's a bit unclear sometimes where the clear trunk might be because the leaves are all gone if it's a cropped tree or cropped palm. So you got to figure out what method you're going to use to measure the height of that tree. And terminus height is a handy approach for establishing that height that you wish to see. Tipped leaf, we talked about that before in the grading process. Not a bad idea when you're dealing with some of those trees that can benefit from the reduction in transpiration or the difficulties associated with the tree that might have some stress on the bud because the leaves are remaining long. Trunk constriction, this is also something that you've got to address in your specifications because it is not necessarily a problem for the health of the tree. It just went through a period of time there where it had some lean years, and that constriction took place when that tree was either reestablishing, or we had an extended drought, or we didn't have fertilizer, or we did have fertilizer. Something was going on that changed the response of that tree to its environment. And the cabbage palm that we're looking at here, I've seen that time and time again in the landscape. What happened was this lower part of the trunk was the original diameter or caliper of that palm tree, of that cabbage palm. And then when it was dug and shipped, it went through a period of reestablishment. And here's a little bit of constriction right here. And then it got into the landscape where it got regular water, probably benefited a little bit from turf fertilizer, or it was in a happy place. And so we've got this trunk caliper, and then the intermediate where we've got a constriction here, and then we've got the more robust growth after the tree is fully reestablished. It's not unusual to see this with cabbage palms. They come out of a place where they had a pretty Spartan existence. Then they went through a period of time of reestablishment, and then they got happy again, and they're growing like thunder. And above that point right there, you've got an expanded caliper. That's a function of that new environment. Vertical clearance, that's a fairly simple complex. That complex applies to the, excuse me, to vehicular foot traffic, bicycles, golf carts, whatever might be traveling under that palm tree. You want to have a clearance, and that's the clearance concept is covered by vertical clearance. You just gotta have that so people don't get whacked with a palm frond or poked with a thorn or whatever. Here's a picture where we see, and this of course is a crown shaft species, and it shows where all of those concepts, that those terms in the glossary are applied in that picture there. And sometimes a picture is worth the previous 1,000 words that I spent trying to describe all of this. All right, let's move on to some examples. Now these examples, these are all phoenix palms. They all came from our farm. And right over here, I see this one has burlap, so that one was going offshore. And this one, this is when our seeds, these are seed grown trees. So you're going to see quite a bit of variation in the characteristics, form and dimensions of those trees that are seed grown. And basically all palm trees are seed grown, with the exception of those clonal varieties that are grown from pups, the dactylifera species, or the dactylifera clones. And over time, we refined our genetics, so more of our trees are like the one on the left-hand side. The one on the right-hand side, we had a guy that used to, that's all he ever wanted. He would come and he would hand select those that had more narrow canopies. That seemed to suit him and the job sites that where he was using these trees. Most people like them like this. So out of my wife's in my front yard, we have a tree that we collect all of the seeds that we use for our stock. And so they're much more like this. There's still some variation because, again, there's that genetic crapshoot that's a part of the process. So you're going to get some variation grown under the exact same set of circumstances, same fertilizer, same soil type, same everything program, watering and anything you might care to think of, but different products. So it's pretty simple to see how in your specs, when you're starting to deal with form and dimensions, you've got a dramatic difference in the impact that these trees are going to have in the landscape. Over on the right-hand side, I think these were curved, maybe courtesy of I think that was Irma maybe that came through and tossed those things around. Didn't get them all straightened up like we'd have liked to. So we were fortunate to have somebody come along and says, oh, okay, we're doing a lagoon for a theme park in Orlando, and this is where those trees went. And so they've got this lazy river thing that they were using these trees for because they wanted their watercraft to float down beneath these trees and create this Amazonian type environment, I suppose. And if your design, you're using a tree or a palm that you want a curved trunk for a specific effect on your job, that might suit you just fine. But as we look at these trees, keep in mind when you go back to the grading part of the process, each one of these trees is a Florithancy. Each one of them has the same type of diamond cut for the trunk treatment. What is different is obvious, the form, the curved on the right versus the straight on the left, and the dimensional aspects. I think I've got those dimensions of those trees maybe in the next slide here. Let's look at that. Yeah, over on the right hand, you see that at 3 feet, and remember, it's recommended when you do talk about caliper, also say, I want this caliper taken at 3 feet or 5 feet or wherever you want. 3 feet is a fairly common height for the caliper to be taken. And so what we want to do, as much as possible, let's try to keep this fairly consistent. So the 3 foot measurement for caliper was 1 foot, 12 inches. Over on the other, it was 1.5 times that great. And so the impact of that tree on the left is going to be very different from the one on the right. The spread on the one on the left is considerably greater than it is on the right. But again, we're dealing with both of these trees are Florida fancies. And so if you want to have this tree versus this tree, or the other tree versus the larger one on the left, it's the way to get there is to provide those dimensional requirements that again are contractual to your whoever's going to be providing the tree for you. All right, let's move on to the next frame here and see what that has in store for us. All right, this is a Livistona. This is a ribbon palm. And I've got up here, it says sometimes it's tempting to simply state typical of species. Well, I'm going to show you how taking the easy way out here might not be a really good idea. This is going to show us how specifications are important, opacity, and I guess maybe I should move on to the next frame to show you another ribbon palm. And this ribbon palm is planted like 25 feet away from the other one. So if we're going to say that we want something that is typical of species, what then in fact is typical of this species? You can't blame it on nutrition and moisture or anything else that might have been a variable that led to this difference in appearance other than genetics. And again, going back to genetics, when we have a seed grown plant, you're going to get some genetic variability. You get variability even if it's clonally grown, but that's a function of environment. That's a nurture versus nature thing. Now, there's an obvious difference, and I mentioned opacity, obvious difference in opacity, but there's also a difference in canopy spread, the difference between, excuse me, the difference between if we're going to call both of these fancies, and I'm pretty sure they are, there's a difference between the overall height and the clear trunk height, because there's a difference in the frond length and the canopy spread. So when we get into really fine tuning and going back to the Starbucks analogy, if we start talking about do you want one type of amendment in your beverage versus another? That measure of specificity we all seem to appreciate, but somehow or another we don't quite get it when it comes to understanding the measure of as it applies to differences in the dimensions of the same species of tree when we start trying to describe what we want for our landscape. The difference the impact can be significantly different based on the characteristics which we have the tools now so we can adequately describe. We can say that I don't want 2% milk, I want half and half, or I want cream. So whichever one of these you consider to be the most gratifying in that respect, okay, I want the full measure and not the half measure over here. Maybe that analogy failed me, but I'm drinking coffee now, so that seemed to be somehow or another relevant to me, which doesn't necessarily mean it was relevant to you, but I liked it. So here's a potential checklist that we might use for measuring trees. And again, as much as we can, we want to quantify this, because the further we get away from subjectivity and defining the tree, the better off we're going to be. That's why the form and dimension part of your specifications is so important. So when you start getting into these things that can be quantified, use those as much as you can to really nail it down. There are other aspects. It can go so far as to say, I want this measure of hydration. That can be quantified. You can say, I want this tool used and I want this level of hydration in the root ball at the time of shipment. And I talked before about how difficult it is to play catch up when you've got a dry palm tree showing up on a job site. Well, don't allow that to happen. Tell them I want that thing fully hydrated. If you mess around with it, then I'm going to reject your tree based on this criterion that's a part of the contract that you're expected to abide by. When we first establish grade, there are things that are taken care of. You've got a leaf count and leaf quality that's automatically assigned. You've got a root ball measurement that's already assigned. You've got certain health characteristics that are addressed. So these specifications are beyond and really sort of outside of those criteria, which we call standards, and now we're dealing with specifications. Here's another example of a Phoenix palm, and it's got what I would consider to be kind of the bare minimum of specifications. What it doesn't have there is a vertical clearance, and it might not have something else that you can think of. It does have the straight trunk, the diamond cut, the caliper, and the clear trunk measurement. So we've got most of that stuff addressed here that would be important. And again, if you're dealing with a supplier or a contractor that has a reputation for meeting your expectations, then maybe there are no worries. But if you're putting this out to bid, or if you're dealing with people that you say, this source I don't know, or I have concerns about, then I would be very careful to get my specifications just so you and your customer aren't disappointed. Now here's a list of palm specs. Now Each one of them starts off with the assignment of a grade. If you look over here in this right-hand part here, we say Florida number 1 or Florida number 1, fancy, and so forth. So that's the proper way to go about that. And if these specs are specific enough, if they're tight enough, if they're complete enough to achieve the desired end, then they were great specs, right? But if somehow or another they failed us, if they turned out to be a little shy of whatever our expectations were, then maybe we should have included another factor in that narrative that becomes a part of our specifications. So if they cover the point, as I said before, don't go any further. Don't get off into the weeds. Don't spend more time on it, or perhaps create a specification that might create a problem. All right, now we're going back to what basically this has all been about, is your obligation to provide quality assurance. And talking with Joe about this, and Joe, again, he is a expert witness in court cases. He's a consultant, and so he has occasion to deal with some of the problems that are associated with failures of trees and of landscape architects or other specifiers in the industry who have not fulfilled this obligation. And so don't create an exposure for yourself by failing to do this, and don't end up disappointing your customer, because it's going to be a problem for you on one level or another if you don't get all of the matters of quality assurance addressed. So by all means, try to do that. And this last frame here is just kind of fun, I thought. A cabbage palm that I saw up in a state park near Savannah, Georgia. We have ongoing conversations with the people at the Palm Research Center over in Fort Lauderdale about, okay, if this damage occurred, and it occurred apparently a long time ago, how long was that tree vulnerable to either pathological or insect or whatever kind of invasion possibilities might be surrounding it? So did that tissue change enough to allow that tree to, or that palm to enter into a state where it was no longer susceptible to invasion? It's certainly as ugly as sin, but it's got, even though that vascular tissue is dramatically reduced there, it has the capacity to provide for all of the processes that are necessary to that continued growth of that palm. So, all right, going to wrap things up at this point. We're going to share with you some additional information. This PowerPoint is available on our website. Remember, grading process is based on the application of criteria, which we call standards, and the specifying is a different thing again. We're going to have another Palm Quest coming up, and well, so far it's been in April 10th and 11th. And if you're seeing this after April 10th and 11th of 2024, then there'll probably be another one coming on next year. We thought about doing this every other year, but apparently there are enough folks out there who haven't been able to come, and we're trying to do it on an annual basis for at least a while. Go to our website for some of these PowerPoints. If you've got questions, email my daughter Lori. And Lori, is your website on here? I don't see it.
Yeah, my email is on there for him.
Where is it?
It's right here on the PowerPoint.
Oh, it's on their side.
Yeah.
I'm looking at my side. Okay, so here you are, folks. If you've got questions or criticisms, they don't even have to be constructive. You can be ugly about it, but let us know what you think about this, and we'll try to work on it to make it better for your growth as a professional. Thanks and goodbye. I think we did better that time.